So we have two keynotes. The first keynote for this next presentation is going to be Brian Helmke, Associate Professor at University of Virginia. His research interests are investigating how living cells and tissue adapt to their environments by alternating structures, gene protein expressions, and biochemical functions. The professional service is recognized for contributing to biomedical engineering education, including developing novel research training programs and integrative teaching laboratories, and then active in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within biomedical engineering. Some highlight awards are the UVA Alumni Association Distinguished Professor Award 2024, elected fellows for American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering in 2024, elected fellow for Biomedical Engineering Society in 2023, and the Harold S. Morton Jr. Undergraduate Teaching Prize on 2020. Our second keynote is David O'Neill, Professor of Instruction at Northwestern University. Research interests include curricular development in biomedical engineering, implementation of mastery-based grading schemes, and development of vertical curricula. Also enhancing synoptic learning throughout the biomedical engineering degree path. Professional service includes activity in promoting engineering education research and curricular development, as well as current projects in implementing mastery-based grading schemes and developing vertical curricula. Some awards include the Cole Higgins Awards for Outstanding Teaching and Advising on 2024, Research and Mentorship, the Fletcher Prize for Excellence in Research Mentorship, Educational Technology Teaching Fellowship, and the Walter P. Murphy Society Award for Low-Cost BME Laboratory Development. So I'm going to kick it off to my keynotes. Oh, Northwestern. I was corrected. Let's go ahead and correct the slide. Northwestern. There you go. I apologize for the typos, David. The other East. Yes.
Country.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to start, and Brian is going to be controlling the slides. Unfortunately, I'm in the middle of a double teaching day with a faculty meeting, and my afternoon class, which starts in 45 minutes, is in the far reaches of campus. So I'm going to have to step out slightly before the end, but Brian is very capable of going to wrap things up at the end of this. So our keynote is based on some of the work that Brian, myself, and Casey Ankeny have been doing, thinking about and trying to promote and publicize the idea of alternative grading strategies. We've heard words like ungrading, and we'll come to those later with some discussion. But really, how can we implement and use alternative grading strategies to foster equity? So with that, we like to start off with people thinking. You've had a 10-minute break. Well, I want you to sort of just very briefly reflect on what comes to mind when you think of grading. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this, think for not too long, not too deeply. We don't want to tax you too much on a Thursday. But we want to think. I want you to type in chat, but not submit anything. And then after 60 seconds, what we'll do is I'll do a 3, 2, 1, and we can all submit our answers together. All right, we'll do a slow countdown. We'll go for 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see them. And this is a trick I do with my students because it grants a certain amount of anonymity, because you're just putting out answers kind of into the ether. We're not really looking to see what any one individual's putting. And we've got a spread, as we might expect. We could definitely got anxiety. Is that anxiety from the instructor or anxiety from the student? Anxiety giving grades or anxiety receiving grades? Quantity of effort, time and effort, rubrics, exactly, more rubrics, and everything above. Thank you, Xavier. Okay, so I'm going to reflect on that. Feel free to scroll and see what the general consensus is, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. So Brian is going to give a little bit of a history and sort of situate us.
So notice that this is a form of feedback that is an inclusive teaching strategy. Because everybody is submitting at the same time, everybody has a chance to submit their thoughts and no one is called out individually. Use this all the time in Zoom. So you might be wondering where grades come from if we're thinking about how we use grades. Grades, the way we know them now, sort of started at Harvard. And Harvard created, for their exit exams, they awarded medals for the high performers. And then they assigned seats in the courses based on where you ranked. So that was the sort of earliest recorded way of putting grades together. Yale soon followed. Yale created 4 categories for their oral exams. Optimi, we have to remember our Latin here, I guess. Optimi, the best, right? Second optimi, the second best. Inferior, and what's worse than inferior? Worse, for Joyce. So those were the categories that Yale used. Harvard eventually decided to make the rankings public. And their thinking was that if the rankings are public, everybody knows if you are underperforming because they can see it. And this will, in their words, increase student attention and encourage good moral conduct. So right away from the beginning, grades used as a punishment or a negative reinforcement for students. Yale started assigning grades at the course level using a 4-point scale, and Harvard using a 100-point scale in 1837, which brings up questions. How do you decide the difference between a 99 and a 98, maybe, when assigning a grade? And then Mount Holyoke created what we now recognize as the 5-letter system towards the end of the 1800s. They originally worded letters A through E, and E was a 75%. Anything below 75 was the lowest category. In 1898, they added the letter F for fail, so that they could be more explicit to the other letters. And then they adjusted the percentages. They didn't lower the percentage for when you fail. They just adjusted everything else. So before the 1800s, most education was happening in the families. School didn't play such a big role in education as it does today. So the assessment was mostly formative. It was mostly verbal. It was happening within the family. And then things started changing in the early 1900s with the rise of manufacturing. With the rise of manufacturing, factories needed trained workers. They are focused on standardization. And as people come from the more rural areas into the cities to get jobs in factories, there's a need for specialization, for chain of command, for efficiencies, for standardization, everything looking the same. And so there was an attempt to spread grading from just the highest level educational institutions to pretty much everything. In fact, we often look when we buy meat in the grocery store for grade A meat and grade A eggs and so on. So this was carrying over. So in needing workers, these jobs drew people from rural areas, and there were also a large influx of immigrants into the United States in the early 1900s. In fact, by 1920, 40% of the US population had foreign-born parents. So large influx of immigrants. And so schools now had to take on the job of Americanizing the students that were coming into the cities to work in these jobs. So the schools were focused on teaching punctuality and attention to detail and silence and listen to the person in charge. In other words, teaching students, humans, to function like the machines in the factories. There were competing ideas about education at this time. Progressive educators were emerging, like John Dewey, who was arguing that schools are in fact critical to the democratic engine in the United States, not a training ground for learning skills anymore. So this sort of took over and led to thinking about things like intelligence testing and categorization. Scientists were exploring the idea of natural intelligence. Intelligence is innate, immutable, and we can quantify it with things like intelligence tests, IQ tests. This was a time when phrenology, the size and shape of your cranium, was thought to be an indicator of your character, your moral character, and your mental abilities. This was a time when UVA became a leader in eugenics, sort of controlling who's allowed to have children and who's not allowed to have children. And the IQ tests were then applied to categorize people into which jobs they should have, categorize soldiers in World War I for which roles they could play. Um, and these tests were then creating categories which supposedly proved a difference between races in terms of intelligence. It was good at sorting people, right? And what it was really measuring, of course, we now view was systemic racism and the inequities that people were experiencing. Behaviorism emerged at this time, Pavlov and Skinner. Humans can be taught to act in certain ways through external stimuli, grades, for example. So this became popular again in factories and standardization. So at this time, Black students and minority students were being sorted out of the system. As we move into the 20th century, the E vanished from the scale. It just became A, B, C, D, F as a grading scale. But folks, with some of the social changes in the 1960s and 1970s, other kinds of grading systems started to be explored: pass-fail grading, contract grading, now and then more recently, standards-based grading, specifications grading, collaborative grading, ungrading, a lot of different styles of grading now with different goals for how to support students are now starting to emerge. So that's where we are now. I want to share with you this quote that I thought was meaningful. We know that students' family income and other variables have a huge influence on achievement, but at the end of the day, it's their grades, our description of students' academic performance, that opens doors or closes them. We can learn a new curriculum or a new instructional strategy, but if the grading doesn't change, nothing for our students, particularly those most vulnerable, will really change, and the achievement and the opportunity gaps will remain. Melissa Coe at Stanford has described this as instructors spending time learning to close the achievement gap in how we instruct, how we plan activities in the classroom, but then we keep the traditional grades. And so the grades are impacting students who identify with historically marginalized identities in a negative way, which suggests that how the student work is evaluated is also contributing to what we're calling achievement gap. Things to think about. So how do we put this in practice? Here's an example. Suppose I design a course and my grading plan is 2 buckets of things, 5 homeworks and 2 tests, and each bucket is worth 50% of the grade. Okay, I can write the assessments in a way that are roughly mapped to the course content. So that's what we might call outcomes if we're thinking about accreditation. I might even put in some professional objectives, critical thinking, problem solving, synthesis. And so I'm going to put this into my course, and student number 1 in my course earns these scores on each of the assessments. Course average of 85 when I just compute the average using my weighting. But notice there's some low scores in there. Homework 3, test 1, homework 4. The middle of the semester, the student wasn't scoring at the same level as they were at the beginning and the end of the semester. So I might, as an instructor, think, well, that student was having some struggles in the middle. I might think they didn't learn the learning objectives that we were working on in the middle. If I'm thinking in a more equity-minded way, I might think they may have had some struggles outside the class that I could have helped with, okay? In any event, this student still earned a B in the class. How about student number 2? Student number 2 also earned a B in the class, but the scores were more even through the semester. Does this mean that the student learned more in the middle and less at the beginning? Does it mean that the students learned 85% of the things all the way through? How do we really assess what pieces student number 1 and student number 2 learned as they went through the semester.
And so that raises questions over why we might change the grading approach. We can see that there's some inconsistencies there. So grades are inconsistent, as we've talked about there. The two summary numbers of 85 describe two very different student experiences. Brian talked about where grades were dropped out historically and letters were applied in thresholds. And different grade numbers mean different things to different people. The British system, typically anything above a 70 is your top grade. But the passing grade is 30%. So most people sit between 30 and 75%, and you don't see anything higher. So with the idea that so other inconsistencies might include the idea that maybe we grade problem sets more generously than final exams. We want to encourage people to do well, and we're like, well, they're getting effort in there. So maybe there's elements of giving participation credit. Is there participation credit? Is that explicit? Is that implicit? How are we measuring that? And how are we contributing that? Are we contributing that fairly? So one of the motivations for changing grading approach is to try and shift this emphasis from a direct performance metric and try to shift towards a growth mindset for the students, that they want to grow, they want to continue to develop. In terms of looking at the grading approach, so it's been shown that grading approach can affect things like curiosity and risk-taking. People are so worried about nickel-diming every last percent that they're not prepared to take a step out and get something wrong because it might be wrong. It's been well shown that grading approach affects psychological health, which probably links into what Karen was talking about this morning. And grading affects relationships between other learners as well as with instructors. And kind of this all bundles up with other issues of equity. So what does equitable grading look like? So these are some sort of a stance point of what are the objectives, looking for two different resources that are sort of be put out there of what should we look for in terms of equitable grading. And we're looking for things like feedback on learning progress. That whole formative feedback, people want to know how they're doing better. And we want our grades to communicate that, but do they always? We want them to be authentic. We want them to be working for the sort of true reflection. We want them to be transparent. We want them to be bias resistant. We want them to be, again, on the previous slide, looking towards a growth orientation rather than something fixed and static. And then David Clark and Talbot set, again, these similar sort of mappings. They say that we want equitable grading needs to be clearly defined. We want it to be context appropriate, and we want to be looking at standards. Grading should be helpful, and there should be actionable feedback. We want marks and the scores to indicate progress. Again, the idea of growth. And there should be the option for reattempts without penalty. Not necessarily unlimited reattempts, but there should be an opportunity to err and improve. And you can see that these kind of all compass together, but those are kind of goals. And we wanted today to sort of highlight some options within the big umbrella of alternative assessments. So people often say, well, what are alternative assessments? And they're simply an alternative to conventional grading. And there are a whole plethora of different techniques. There are tiny things you can do, and there are whole course-wide revamps you can do. We like to think of these somewhat as, you can see on the left, these are just some examples, but I've kind of grouped them together with kind of different techniques or different alternative grading options, often focus at one set of problems. And so at the top, we've got some ones in orange, which are really looking at agency. Can we make students agents in their grading? That's not necessarily they do their own grading, but it's a case of, can we get them invested and engaged with the grading process? So we've got contract grading, we've got self or peer evaluations going in there. We've got co-created rubrics, and I'll expand upon that in the next slide, and then things like process letters. And then we've got another category, and we've got things like standards-based grading, which Casey and I do in some of our courses. We've got specs-based grading, which Brian will talk about in a couple of minutes, and minimal grading. And that's kind of taking a step back and saying, let's not look at every single point, and let's look at what are our goals, what are our objectives, and try to take a sort of a bird's eye view of abilities and moving forward. And then kind of the most radical step, where you have some real zealots at the bottom going for them, and I haven't stepped this far, but is the idea, sort of the broad category of ungrading, and that's sort of reducing grades heavily, or perhaps even no grades. So we've got the idea of, I've got a colleague here in CS who has a do, review, redo, basically ad infinitum. You can do it until the course ends. And the whole option there is he wants students to perfect their code and really drive forward their development as they go through. And it almost doesn't matter how many coding assignments they do, so long as they're improving. So taking an example, I wanted to give you a small example. That's something that Casey Ankeny, Ken Gentry, and I have been doing with our second year experimental design, introduction to experimental design course. And it's what I'm actually doing in half an hour with my students. So it's the idea of co-created rubrics. And you can take this to different levels, and you can sort of invest in this to different amounts. But a co-created rubric roughly runs in 3 steps. The first step is you come to class with your proposed rubric. I'm going to be doing this with sort of mini lab reports with the students. They're actually more like ASWE extended abstracts, but that's the assignment that we want these students. And this is something that students have seen lab reports time and time again, and they learn how to write a lab report for this organic chemistry instructor, or they learn to write how to write a lab report for the waves and optics lab in physics. And they're not really stepping back. And so we wanted them to have an opportunity to kind of direct and engage with the rubric. So the first thing is you come with your rubric that you are as a starting point, and you also bring along some example work. It could be a past lab report, it could be a couple. And you provide both to the students, and you say, there you go. You've got an example work, and it's not perfect work, but here's an example piece of work, and here's a rubric. And so through that, you actually get some transparency. You're seeing, students are seeing the process. That then links into, after they've sort of tried it out, you have some form of reflection, some sort of feedback. We're going to have a class discussion today to start with a small group discussion and then sort of break it out. And students are going to reflect on that process. And they're going to ask me questions about, does the rubric capture the degree of success of that lab report? And whether it does or whether it doesn't, students can then suggest rubric revisions. So there's engagement. And then that links into the final bit where we have the final say if we want. And so I'm going to review all the submissions with our TAs, and we're going to come up with our options and work out how we're going to change the wording or change the scaling of different items on the rubric. And this is the really important bit. We're going to report back with a rationale for why we're doing it. We're going to explain why we came up and made the decisions to accept or partially accept the students from the students. And there's an element here that also increases acceptance from the students. You click Brian, there are other options in there. So I'm going to be doing a class discussion. You don't have to do that. Students can just submit revisions to the rubric through a Google form. You could do the whole process multiple times. So we could do this for the first lab report, then students try it out. And then for their second lab report, we go through again and they want to revise the rubric, co-create. You could also do this. I suggested starting off with a draft rubric, and that's the easiest way to do it. You could start the whole activity with a brand without a rubric. And so students are generating the rubric from scratch. So that is a simple thing. You can do it for a problem set. You could do it for a single activity. But I think there is it's a multifaceted approach, and it's a really easy in to something that is actually really appreciated by students. So Brian is going to talk about something now a little bit more complex, specifications grading.
Specifications grading, the way that Linda Nilsson defines it, is a whole system. It's really upending the grading system in the course. Now, I'll also point out a couple of ways that you could do this at a smaller scale in particular projects or assignments, for example. So it's basically, the idea is that specifications are what you would define as requirements for success or requirements for showing learning. An easy way to think about it is sometimes specifications look very similar to the way you would write a rubric, except instead of writing a rubric with 3 levels, 5 levels, however many levels, you're just writing a rubric with 1 level. Here's what it takes to demonstrate that you met the learning objective for an assignment, a project, or whatever. The course grades are then determined based on meeting specs in bundles of activities that are mapped to the course objectives. So for example, in one of my courses, I have a tiered sets of activities so that maybe we would have homeworks, maybe we would have some summative assessments, maybe we would have lots of practice activities. And so to earn a B in the class, you might have to meet specs on some number of practice activities, plus some number of homework assignments, plus some number of summative assignments. And that number that you meet changes with depending on the grade level that you want to try to meet for your course grade. And in any case, those numbers are spread across the semester in ways that meet all of the learning objectives at different levels so that no learning objective is left out. So the advantages are that it makes things transparent. The assignment and learning objectives are up front at the top of every assignment. The specs are defined. This would be similar to sharing a rubric with your students when you share the assignment instructions, so that everything is transparent for the student. They have control over the level of work, effort, learning that they want to accomplish for those activities. The activities are tiered in ways that move a student from novice to expert, the way that I have it set up in my classes at least. And so you can interact with the different learning objectives in the course at different levels. You have some choice. For example, in one of my classes, you don't have to meet specs on all 4 tests in order to get an A in the class. The thinking is that it's hard to convince me that anyone coming out of a class is expert on everything in the class for the whole semester, right? That's really challenging. And so that shouldn't be the bar for an A. So the activities are put together in bundles in ways that it's okay to mess up. It's okay to have some flexibility and choice, especially if you have other classes, other personal things outside of class happening in your life. The specs are usually defined, since it's 1 level, the specs are usually defined at I would call a B level of work. By defining the specs at sort of a high level, that means that we can maintain the academic rigor by setting what does this look like to be successful at meeting these learning objectives. Some students might do more and become more expert because they're really into that part of the course content, and that's okay. They have the choice to do that. There are ways to construct the spec system to provide multi-levels, but the way that if we're just doing specs grading, then it's a meet specs or not yet kind of assessment. What's key is there are lots of opportunities for feedback and retrying things, revising things in this system. So if you didn't meet specs, you're not necessarily done unless you want to be. You have chances to revise and retry and up the level of the work that you're doing. So in terms of the grading, this makes life a lot easier. We're not trying to decide, is this answer worth 3 points or 2 points? We're not trying to impose arbitrary cutoffs between levels of work. You meet the specs or you don't, and that makes it easy to figure out grading. So it's less conflict, less time than it is in assigning points in a system. And there's higher inter-rater consistency among graders because we can talk about what the spec means and everybody has that same definition as they're doing the grading. So that is a big system. And so you might thinking, well, that's all great. I'm not going to jump in the deep water and upend my whole course. How do I get started? Dave, do you have time still to talk or do you have to
I
leave?
do. I do.
Excellent.
So we wanted to give options and ideas and thoughts of ways to get in. So these are all variable options, and they all no one option is perfect. So there are imperfections and problems with each of them, but each one of these approaches kind of is a way at digging apart, digging into, and trying to address something. So one option might be to increase the weight of assignments as the quarter progresses. There are many slow starters in the quarter, people that really don't quite get the material early on and then figure it out. I was a slow starter, and so I loved the British system where I wasn't assessed until the final 4 days of my first year, and that counted for everything because that gave me 6 months to learn some topics that I didn't like at the beginning. We could focus the grade calculations on assessments aligned with learning objectives. We have learning objectives. Do all of our assessments perfectly map to them? No, well, probably not. We talked about retakes, we talked about redos, we talked about revisions, and the idea of exam wrappers, opportunities to redo a difficult problem on an exam, maybe under exam conditions. This is kind of the obvious one, but it's worth putting up there. Keep our gradebooks updated. If it's going to be feedback, if it's going to be useful, students need to see how they're doing and where they're going. Another option is to reduce the stakes of major assignments. Miss the exam, have a bad day, just get yourself into worried about a single hard problem on the exam and mess that up and drop a letter grade. Probably not the fairest approach. Are our learning objectives and rubric out there and mapped? Are they publicly mapped? Can students see how the learning objectives that we publish actually directly tie to what they're doing, how they're being assessed, and what the instructions are? I talked about having discussions in class, talking to your students about their grades beforehand, during, and afterwards. And that doesn't have to be specifically speaking to student B about their grade. It can be talking about the grading process. And then maintaining high expectations. We don't have to dumb down. Ungrading is not dumbing down. So with that in mind, these are just some starting points. From these or from others, we'd like you to do a little bit of self-reflection, and we'd like you just to take a couple of minutes to write down for yourself. And writing down is a nice way of slightly committing to something. We'd like you to write down one example, one aspect of alternative assessment that you might try in your course. And as you do that, who or which group of students would this change particularly benefit?
So maybe we can come back together and let me ask if we have anyone brave who would like to share an idea, ask a question, maybe share an idea that you came up with for your course. Maybe it's something you're already almost doing or something you might tweak a little bit or something that you are already doing that maybe fits in some of these ideas. You can either raise your hand or you can type in the chat. Yeah, good. Transparency, 3 elements of transparency. Purpose, why are we doing this? The task, what are we doing? And then the criteria, what constitutes success. Other ideas that anybody would like to contribute?
I think something I do in capstone and design is for the big reports, which tend to be bigger assessment, is just allow redos. Gives the students a feedback and say, hey, I noticed this area is a little wonky. Make sure that you make a claim or make a statement, and then give them a week to just repair and then have a conversation with them. Because I feel often with these types of ungrading strategies, you have to be supportive. You can't just be nilly-willy, just have them do the stuff. So that's at least for me.
Yeah, the feedback cycle is super important. Absolutely. If your students are doing writing, maybe they're writing a lab report or doing some other kind of writing in your class, scientific writing. many of us ask for a draft assignment before doing a final paper. And sometimes we think about it as just checking in so students don't wait till the last minute. It's also an opportunity to provide feedback and do a revision. So that's allows you especially to help those students that are maybe struggling with writing for different reasons. Excellent. So hopefully this gives you some low-hanging fruit that you can think about, maybe things you're already doing or almost doing that make it seem doable to adjust how you're doing grading in ways that promote equity and inclusion in your classroom. So how do you get started with these kinds of things? I highly recommend starting small and just changing one thing at a time. We're scientists. How do we know if what we did had a positive impact if we changed too many things all at once? Hopefully you can leverage things that you're already doing to make these small changes, thinking about how they're impacting different students differently in the class. Transparency has came up a couple of times. Transparency is super important. What is the purpose? Why are we doing this? What's the task? What do we have to do? And how do we do those things? And what are the criteria for success? What do we have to accomplish or achieve? I want to remind you that you're not alone in trying these efforts. There are a lot of us here in the Beak community that you can talk with. So plug the Beak Slack channel for Alexis. You might talk with your teaching and learning center or other colleagues at your institution. Please feel free to reach out to us. And I'll share this slide through Alexis of some references that we referred to in the workshop today that might be useful for you as you embark on your own thinking about how to adjust what you're doing with grading. So thank you so much for having us today. I'm happy to answer questions if we have time.